Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources and, well, try to pull out those key insights to get you informed fast. So, have you ever found yourself, maybe after a rough night's sleep, thinking, ugh, must be the full moon? Or maybe you've heard people talk about mood swings or even, suggest holding off on surgery until the moon phase is just right. It's a really common idea, isn't it? This belief that the moon, especially the full moon, affects our bodies, our minds, even how we heal. Sounds a bit fanciful, maybe.
It does sound a bit like, well, the title of the paper we're looking at today, Howling at the Moon.
Exactly. So today our deep dive is tackling that exact question. Does the moon actually impact post-surgical pain or, say, the side effects you might get? We're digging into this specific research paper by Komen, Weinman, and Meisner. And our mission really is to unpack what they found, look at the hard evidence, and figure out if you, our listener, need to consult a lunar calendar before booking surgery. Let's see what surprising facts pop up.
Well, the first thing to realize is just how deep this belief runs. It's not new. It's really woven into history, astrology, this long human search for meaning in the cosmos. People have looked up at the moon for millennia and felt it must influence us down here.
And it just sticks around, doesn't it? Even with science saying otherwise, lots of people still believe it. The paper mentions over 10% of Germans, and get this, 40% of clinical staff. That's a lot of doctors and nurses potentially thinking the moon matters.
It's a huge number, yeah. And previous studies have tried to find a link.
Yeah.
They usually look at things in a few buckets, like forensic stuff, crime rates, violence, then behavioral things, alcohol use, suicide rates, effects on women, specifically birth rates, miscarriages, and then general medical stuff like heart attacks or overall surgical mortality. And the consistent finding, pretty much nothing, no measurable effect linked to the moon phase.
Okay, so zooming in on surgery then, what are the specific beliefs there? I've heard bits and pieces.
Right. The popular notion is that new moon and full moon days are like the absolute worst times for an operation. The idea is you'll have higher death rates, more complications, definitely more pain, worse side effects, the works. There's even this quote in the paper from Punger and Pup saying something like, closer to full moon is worse. Full moon day is the worst. Operate during the waning moon if you can choose. Pretty direct.
Wow, yeah, that leaves no room for doubt in their minds.
Yeah.
But you said other surgical studies were done before this one. Did they find anything?
Nope. Studies looked at post-op nausea, lung cancer surgery deaths, hip replacement complications, outcomes after bladder removal, all sorts of things. And again, consistently, they just didn't find any measurable lunar effect. So you have this really strong popular belief clashing with a pretty solid wall of scientific nope, which makes this study interesting because it focuses specifically on post-op pain, the psychological side of it, and side effects from pain meds areas that hadn't been looked at quite as closely before in relation to the moon.
Okay, got it. Widespread belief, previous studies say no, but this study is looking at some new angles. So let's really unpack this paper by Coleman and colleagues. What exactly were they trying to find out, and what did they guess they'd find?
Their objective was super clear. Investigate if lunar phases affect post-surgical pain, the sort of psychological impact of that pain, like anxiety or feeling helpless, and also the side effects of pain treatments. And their hypothesis, right from the start, also really clear. They expected to find no effect. They were basically setting out to see if the popular belief held up to scrutiny, but suspected it wouldn't.
A classic null hypothesis approach. Makes sense. So how did they get the data? This sounds like it would need a lot of information.
Yeah, they did. They used data that was already collected by a big international project called Pain Outie. It's funded by the European Commission, all about improving post-op pain management. So a really solid source.
Okay. And how many patients are we talking about?
A lot. They analyzed data from 12,224 patients, screened from over 16,000 originally. And this wasn't just one hospital. It was data from 2010, 2011 across 10 hospitals in NLMDD. Let's see, Germany, Spain, Italy, France, UK, Sweden, Romania, Israel, Switzerland. So a really broad international sample.
Wow, okay. That definitely gives us some weight. And who are these patients typically?
They were all adults, 18 or older, who were hospitalized for surgery, and they had to be able to fill out a questionnaire the day after their operation. The average age was around 55, and it was almost an even split. Male, female, about 49% male.
Right. And what exactly did they ask these 12,000 people? What were the outcome variables?
They looked at 14 different things. Patients rated some stuff on a 0 to 10 scale,
Right.
The numeric rating scale, or NRS. Things like their worst pain, their least pain, how much time they felt they were in severe pain. Also, how much pain interfered with just moving in bed or with sleep. And then psychological stuff. Anxiety, feeling helpless. Plus, side effects from pain relief, nausea, drowsiness, dizziness. And finally, things like how satisfied they were with their pain management, did they wish they'd gotten more treatment, and did they use any non-dread methods like relaxation, a really thorough look.
Very comprehensive. Okay, so they've got all this patient data. How did they link it to the moon?
They grouped patients based on their surgery date into 4 moon phases. You had new moon day, just that single day, then the first phase, which is the waxing period, about 2 weeks, then full moon day again, just that single day, and the last phase, the waning period, another 2 weeks or so. They did note later this was a limitation, having single days versus 2-week blocks, different numbers of patients in each group.
Okay, that makes sense. Unequal groups. And how did they crunch the numbers? What stats did they use?
They used a couple of standard tests. For the 0 to 10 scale answers, they used something called the Kruskal-Wallis H test. It compares the average ranks between the groups. For the simple yes-no questions, they used Pearson's chi-square test. And importantly, they adjusted the analysis to account for things like the patient's age, their gender, and the type of surgery, specifically the 3 most common ones in their data, which were hip replacements, knee replacements, and gallbladder removals. That helps make sure any differences they saw weren't just because, say, older patients happen to have surgery more often during a full moon.
Right, controlling for those other factors. Okay, the methodology seems solid, if complex.
Right.
So, drumroll. What did they actually find? What were the results?
Well, the headline finding, the big takeaway for all patients combined, was pretty much what they hypothesized. For 12 out of the 14 things they measured, there's no statistically significant difference between the lunar phases. So, mostly, the moon just didn't seem to matter. Their hypothesis largely held up.
Mostly. Okay, so there were a couple of exceptions then. What did show a difference for the whole group?
Yes, exactly. 2 things popped up as statistically significant for the overall group. One was pain interference with sleep, and the other was drowsiness. Both had a p-value of 0.01.
Which means unlikely to be just random chance, right?
Right. Statistically speaking, it suggests there might be something going on there.
So how big were those differences? Did people sleep way worse or feel much drowsier on, say, the full moon?
Well, that's the crucial part. The statistical significance was there, but the actual differences in the average scores were pretty small. For sleep interference, the score was highest on the full moon day, averaged 3.22 on that 0-10 scale. Lowest was new moon day at 2.85. For drowsiness, again, highest on full moon day at 3.01, lowest on new moon day at 2.33. So you're talking differences of less than half a point or a bit more for drowsiness on an 11-point scale. The researchers themselves said these differences were likely not clinically important. You probably wouldn't even notice it as a patient. They even suggested the drowsiness might just be because people slept a bit worse, not a direct moon effect itself.
Okay, that makes sense. Statistically significant doesn't always mean practically meaningful.
Yeah.
But you mentioned they looked at subgroups too. Did anything interesting show up when they sliced the data differently?
Yes, this is where it gets, well, a bit more intriguing, maybe even confusing. When they looked just at men, suddenly 7 out of the 14 variables showed statistically significant differences.
7. Wow, that's half of them. And what was the pattern?
For most of those 7 variables in men, the full moon day came out worst, and the new moon day came out best. Now, the actual differences in the scores were still quite small, ranging from 0.4 to about 1.2 points on the 11-point scale. Still likely not clinically huge, but statistically it was there for men specifically.
Interesting. So for men, it kind of followed the popular myth direction, even if the effect was small. What about older patients?
For elderly patients, they define that as over 55, 4 variables showed significant differences. Those were worst pain, pain interfering with sleep, nausea, and drowsiness. And for 3 of those, sleep interference, nausea, drowsiness, the pattern was the same. Full moon worst, new moon best. Differences were around 0.6 to 0.9 points. Worst pain was a little different, full moon was worst, but the waxing and waning phases were actually better than the new moon for that one. Still, a pattern emerges.
Okay, so men and older patients show some statistical signal, leaning towards full moon being worse, new moon better, those small effects. What about women? They're often the focus of moon theories.
Right, and this is maybe the most surprising finding. For women, only 1 variable out of 14 showed a significant difference: time spent in severe pain. But get this, for women, the new moon day was worst, and the full moon day was best.
Wait, the opposite of the popular belief and the opposite of what they saw in men and older patients.
Exactly, completely flips the script. If anything, for women, the full moon seems slightly better for that one measure. It really challenges the whole narrative.
That is fascinating. And any other groups? Younger people? Specific surgeries.
For younger patients, 55 or under, and for the specific surgeries they analyzed separately, hip, knee, gallbladder, no item showed any significant differences at all. Zero. So these small statistical effects seemed confined to men and older patients, and even then, inconsistently, and with women showing an opposite trend for the one thing that was significant for them.
Okay, so, wow. We've got a main finding of no effect overall, but then these little blips of statistical significance in certain groups, sometimes pointing in opposite directions. What does it all mean then? How did the researchers sum this up?
Yeah, it seems messy, but their main conclusion cut through it pretty clearly. They basically said the proclaimed differences in surgical outcomes between lunar phases can be seen as non-existing.
Hmm.
Even with those few statistically significant findings, the overall practical impact just wasn't there.
But what about those 14 statistically significant findings across all the subgroup analyses? That sounds like more than just random chance, maybe.
That's a fair question, and they addressed it. They calculated they ran 112 different comparisons, 14 items across 8 subgroups. Statistically, if you use the standard 5% significance level, p 0.05, you'd actually expect about 5 or 6 of those comparisons to come out significant purely by chance, even if the moon has zero effect.
The multiple comparisons problem.
Exactly. So finding 14 significant results isn't wildly out of line with what you might expect by chance in such a large analysis. And crucially, even for those 14 findings, they stressed again the lack of clinical relevance. The differences in scores were consistently small, clinically not important. It's a good reminder that with huge data sets, tiny, meaningless differences can sometimes reach statistical significance without actually mattering in the real world.
So, bottom line, don't change your surgery date based on the moon.
Absolutely. The paper couldn't be clearer. Thus, none of the results would justify delaying or skipping surgeries because of the moon phase. Ponger and Pop's claim is simply wrong.
And that finding about men versus women, men slightly leaning towards the myth, women slightly leaning against it for one variable that undercuts the usual focus on women and lunar cycles too.
It really does. They noted it was quite interesting because the whole Lunar Believers Society tends to focus the effects on women, maybe linking it to menstrual cycles or something. This study found, if anything, the opposite. And even then, it was just one small effect. It really reinforces their main point. The moon's influence just isn't showing up in a meaningful way in surgical outcomes.
Now, did the researchers mention any weaknesses in their own study? Any limitations we should be aware of?
They did. They were upfront about two main things. First, that unequal grouping of the moon phases, single days for new full moon versus 2 weeks for wax and waning. That meant way fewer patients in the new and full moon groups, which could make it harder to detect a real effect if one existed or make comparisons less stable.
Right, fewer data points for those specific days. What was the other limitation?
The second one was about when the data was collected. Because of how the PainOT project worked, data collection mostly happened Tuesday through Friday. Elective surgeries aren't common on weekends, especially Sundays, meaning collecting data on Mondays, after weekend surgeries, was tricky. The result was that for many of the specific new moon and full moon days in their data set, they actually had fewer than 10 patients. Again, very small numbers, which limits the power to find anything definitive for those specific days.
Okay, that makes sense. Good to keep those limitations in mind.
Yeah.
So let's bring it all home. For you, our listener, what's the key takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the message is really straightforward and honestly, probably reassuring. Despite how common the belief is, this large, well-conducted international study found no good scientific reason to worry about the moon phase when you're having surgery. Those small statistical quirks they found in some groups, they just weren't clinically meaningful. Your pain, your recovery, side effects, the evidence says they just aren't dictated by whether the moon is waxing or waning.
Yeah, pretty clear conclusion. Don't schedule your life or at least your surgery around the moon based on this evidence. But it does leave us with a final thought, doesn't it? Why do these beliefs hang on so tightly? Even when study after study, like this one, says there's nothing there. Maybe it just shows how much we want to find patterns, find connections between us and the universe, even if the data doesn't quite back it up. Makes you wonder what other beliefs we hold on to, maybe without realizing the evidence isn't quite there. Something to think about. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another look at what the research really says.